Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something that goes, well, way beyond just everyday worry. We're talking about specific phobias.
Right. This isn't just, not liking something or feeling a bit anxious. A phobia is really defined as this intense, often irrational fear of a specific thing or situation.
And the fear is totally out of whack with the actual danger, isn't it?
Exactly. It's wildly disproportionate. And it's important to note, these are classified as a type of anxiety disorder.
Okay, and just how common are we talking? Because anxiety disorders in general, the numbers are pretty big.
They are. About a third of U.S. adults and teens will grapple with an anxiety disorder at some point. But specific phobias, they're actually the most common type identified.
Really? More common.
Yeah. The lifetime prevalence sits somewhere between, say, 7.7% and 12.5% in the U.S. If you crunch those numbers, it suggests, well, over a quarter of the population might develop a specific phobia during their life.
Wow. Okay, that's genuinely staggering.
Hmm.
So our mission for this deep dive seems clear. We need to unpack what's going on underneath these really intense fears.
Mm-hmm. We'll be digging into the brain stuff, the neurobiology, but also the thinking patterns and emotional habits that kind of keep these fears going.
And crucially, what can actually be done about them. The treatments.
Absolutely. And just for context, the DSM-5, that's the manual clinicians use, groups them into like 5 main buckets.
Okay.
You've got animal phobias, spiders, dogs, snakes, then natural environment heights, storms, water,
Right.
situational ones like flying, elevators, and closed spaces. Then there's a distinct one, blood injection injury, or BII.
The fainting one.
Often, yeah. And then just a catch-all other category. And these types matter because, as we'll see, what drives a fear of spiders might be quite different from what drives a fear of needles.
Got it. So let's start with the brain's wiring then. How does fear even work at that level?
Well, fear itself isn't bad, right? It's fundamental. It's a survival mechanism, deeply ingrained.
The whole fight or flight thing.
Exactly that. It's run by what we call the defensive survival circuit. It detects a potential threat, and boom, your heart races, you might sweat, adrenaline pumps. It's getting you ready to act.
And which part of the brain is like the command center for this?
The amygdala is really key here. Think of it as the brain's threat detector. It's constantly evaluating input, and it communicates heavily with the prefrontal cortex.
That's the more rational thinking part.
Yeah, the part involved in executive functions, decision-making, and crucially, regulating those emotional responses from the amygdala. When anxiety becomes pathological, like in a phobia, that communication network, it has kind of gotten its wires crossed.
Okay, so everyone has this basic fear circuit.
Mm.
But why does it get attached so strongly to something specific, like, I don't know, pigeons? Is it always because something bad happened with a pigeon?
It can be. That's what we call an experiential phobia. You have a scary or traumatic event. Maybe you were attacked by a dog, and that conditions a phobia of dogs. Classical conditioning.
Makes sense. But you said that's not the only way.
No. There are also non-experiential phobias. These seem to tap into more innate or pre-wired fears. There's this idea called the evolutionary preparedness hypothesis.
Meaning we're kind of programmed from our evolutionary past to fear certain things.
Sort of, yeah. Things that were genuine threats to our ancestors, snakes, spiders, heights, maybe deep water. The theory is we're more easily conditioned to fear these things than, say, toasters or electrical outlets, even though those might be more dangerous today.
So if I fell off a ladder, I'm maybe more likely to develop a lasting height phobia than if I got a nasty shock from faulty wiring, I develop a phobia of plugs. Because heights have that ancient danger tag.
The research suggests exactly that. The brain seems more receptive to locking onto those evolutionarily relevant threats.
Okay, but even if it starts with an event or this preparedness, why does it stay? Why doesn't the brain eventually learn, okay, that spider over there isn't actually going to hurt me? Why does the fear persist so strongly?
That's the million-dollar question, really. It comes down to the mechanisms that maintain it. Some individuals seem to have exaggerated fear conditionability. They learn the fear more strongly in the first place.
Okay.
But critically, phobias are often maintained because of impaired extinction and poor habituation.
Extinction. Like fear extinction,
Hmm.
making it go away.
Yeah, basically. Think of extinction learning as the brain trying to update its files. It learns, okay, this stimulus used to predict danger, but now it's safe. It tries to overwrite the old fear memory.
But in phobias, that process is broken somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Often there are issues with the amygdala's ability to sort of weaken or prune back that original fear connection. We call it issues in depotentiation mechanisms. The brain essentially fails to unlearn the fear, so every exposure just triggers the old alarm. It doesn't habituate, doesn't get used to it.
Right. So this leads to that key question from the research. Not everyone who falls off a ladder gets a phobia. Not everyone bitten by a dog develops one. What makes certain people more vulnerable?
It looks like a mix of things. There are definitely genetic factors involved, but also these physical changes in the amygdala's pathways, what researchers call metaplastic changes, essentially making the fear pathway stronger and harder to erase in some people.
Wow, so actual physical differences in the brain's fear wiring.
Potentially, yes. And another huge factor is an individual's capacity for emotion regulation. How they cope with strong feelings matters a lot.
Okay, let's pivot to those non-biological factors then. The emotion and the thinking side of things. The brain wiring sets the stage, maybe, but how do our thoughts and feelings keep the phobia alive?
Well, researchers have identified some common risk factors across most phobia types. These are called transdiagnostic factors.
Meaning they apply generally, regardless of the specific fear.
Exactly. Things like being younger, being female, females are diagnosed more often, and tendencies towards rumination, worrying a lot, and especially catastrophizing.
Catastrophizing, assuming the absolute worst will happen.
Precisely. If I get on that plane, it will crash. That kind of thinking. Interestingly, phobias often tend to decrease in intensity as people get older.
Huh. Okay. And you mentioned emotion regulation strategies. How do those fit in?
So the research looked at different ways people cope. They grouped them into maladaptive strategies that generally make things worse and adaptive ones.
What are examples of maladaptive ones?
Things like blaming yourself, endless rumination or worrying, and again, catastrophizing.
And adaptive. The good ways to cope.
Strategies like acceptance, acknowledging the feeling without fighting it, or maybe positive refocusing, trying to think about something happy, or refocusing on planning, like making a concrete plan to handle the situation.
Okay, but wait. I remember reading something really surprising here. Positive refocusing, thinking happy thoughts, that sounds adaptive. But the research found it can sometimes make phobias worse.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, that was a really counterintuitive finding. It seems that while positive refocusing can be helpful in some contexts, for phobias, it might actually function as a subtle form of avoidance.
Avoidance. How?
Well, instead of engaging with the feared situation, even mentally, and learning that it's okay, you're essentially distracting yourself. You're pushing the unpleasant feelings away rather than processing them. And we know that any kind of avoidance, even mental distraction, tends to strengthen fear in the long run.
Wow. Okay, so even trying to think positive can backfire if it stops you from actually facing the fear. That really shows how complex this is. What about patterns linked to specific phobia types? Did anything stand out?
Definitely. One cognitive strategy emerged as the big one across the board, the transdiagnostic culprit, if you will.
Let me guess, catastrophizing.
Get it. Catastrophizing was strongly linked to fear intensity across animal phobias, BII phobias, even social anxiety disorder in the studies looked at. It seems to be a major driving force no matter what the specific fear is.
So tackling that tendency to predict disaster is key in treatment.
Absolutely. But there are also some unique factors. For the blood injection injury BII group, the ones who fear needles or seeing blood, marijuana consumption was identified as a unique factor, and interestingly, it was associated with lower fear and interference. It acted as a protective factor in the analysis.
Whoa, okay. That's unexpected. Did the research explain why? Like, are people self-medicating, or is there something else going on? We should be careful here, obviously.
Right. The researchers are cautious, too. It's correlational, not causal. The hypotheses are either that marijuana use might reduce overall physiological reactivity for some people, making the BII stimuli less impactful, or that individuals are perhaps using it strategically, like before a doctor's appointment, as a form of self-treatment to get through it. More research needed there, for sure.
Definitely. Any other unique ones?
For environmental phobias, like heights or storms, unique factors popped up too. Things like self-blame seemed linked to how much the phobia interfered with their life. And using refocus on planning was specifically linked to the fear intensity itself.
Interesting. So the coping strategies really vary depending on the type of phobia.
They do. And this brings us to a really fascinating case study that highlights another crucial point. Sometimes it's not even primarily about fear.
Okay. What else could it be?
Disgust.
Mm-mm.
The case involved compenophobia, a phobia of buttons?
Seriously.
Seriously. And when they dug into it, the boy's primary emotion wasn't fear that the buttons would harm him. It was intense, overwhelming disgust. He described them as gross, disgusting, even having an unpleasant odor.
Wow, so his avoidance wasn't driven by anticipating danger, but by this visceral feeling of revulsion.
Exactly. And this is critical because it shows you have to understand the specific emotional driver for each person. Treating disgust like it's fear just doesn't work.
Which perfectly leads us into treatment. Given these different drivers, fear, disgust, specific thought patterns, how do we actually treat phobias effectively? You said earlier they are very treatable.
They really are. Phobias have some of the best treatment outcomes among psychological problems. Psychotherapy is the frontline approach, and the absolute gold standard is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
And within CBT, there's a specific technique that's key, right?
Yes, exposure therapy, sometimes called systematic desensitization.
It sounds intense confronting your fear head on.
It's done very carefully and systematically. It's not about throwing someone into their worst nightmare. It's about gradual, controlled, safe exposure to the feared stimulus.
Can you give an example? Like for fear of flying.
Sure, you'd create a hierarchy. Maybe step 1 is just thinking about flying. Step 2, looking at pictures of airplanes. Step 3, driving to the airport. Step 4, maybe sitting in a grounded plane or a simulator. And eventually, step 5, taking a short flight.
So you build up tolerance and mastery step by step.
Exactly. The goal is to allow that natural extinction learning process, the brain learning this is safe, to finally happen. You're essentially retraining the fear circuit through experience.
Okay, that's the behavioral part of CBT. What about the cognitive part, tackling the thoughts?
That's cognitive restructuring. This involves identifying those automatic negative thoughts, especially the catastrophic ones we talked about.
Right, the plane will crash.
Yeah, and actively challenging them. Learning to replace them with more balanced, realistic, and constructive thoughts. It's about changing the mental narrative that fuels the fear and fosters a sense of control.
And going back to that button phobia case, it perfectly illustrates why both exposure and cognitive work, tailored to the emotion, are crucial, right?
Yeah.
Because just exposure failed initially.
It did, spectacularly. When they just had the boy handle buttons pure behavioral exposure, his distress ratings actually went up between sessions.
Why again?
Because the treatment was designed to reduce fear, but his core problem was disgust. Handling the gross objects just amplified the disgust.
So how did they turn it around?
They shifted tactics, they used imagery exposure, having him vividly imagine scenarios with buttons, like them falling on him, combined with cognitive restructuring, specifically targeting the disgust thoughts.
Challenging the idea that they were inherently gross or contaminated.
Precisely. And that combination worked. His distress rating when imagining buttons dropped significantly and stayed down from an 8 out of 10 to a 3. They treated the right emotion.
That's a powerful lesson. What about medication? Does it have a role?
It can, but usually not as the primary or standalone treatment for the phobia itself. Medications might be used to manage really severe anxiety symptoms that interfere with therapy, or if someone has a coexisting condition like depression or panic disorder.
What kinds of medications?
Things like SSRIs, antidepressants that affect serotonin, or sometimes beta blockers like propranolol, which specifically target the physical symptoms of anxiety, like a racing heart or trembling. They block the effects of adrenaline.
But there's a potential downside to relying too much on meds for phobias, isn't there? A warning from the research.
Yes, a really important one. There's a risk that medication can become a kind of chemical crutch, or what's called a safety behavior. Meaning, if you take a pill to calm down before facing your fear, you might attribute your ability to cope to the drug, not to your own growing resilience. It can reduce the immediate physical discomfort, sure, but it might actually prevent you from fully engaging in the exposure therapy and achieving that deep, lasting learning that the feared thing is actually safe.
So the medication, while seeming helpful, could actually block the brain from truly unlearning the fear.
It can interfere with that extinction learning process, yeah. You don't get the chance to build that sense of mastery because you think the pill did the heavy lifting. The goal of therapy is to learn you can handle it without the crutch.
So the takeaway seems to be that real change comes from confronting the fear, both behaviorally and mentally, and rewiring the brain's response directly.
That's the core of effective treatment.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together then. What we've really deep dived into shows that these specific phobias aren't simple quirks. They seem to arise from this complex mix of our genetic predispositions, maybe specific learning experiences.
Right, and how our brain's fear circuitry processes or sometimes fails to properly extinguish that fear signal.
And then layered on top of that are these cognitive and emotional habits, like catastrophizing, or even that tricky positive refocusing avoidance that keep the fear locked in place.
Exactly. And the path out involves very targeted treatment, usually exposure therapy combined with cognitive work aimed squarely at the specific fear or, as we saw, the disgust response.
But you mentioned a final provocative thought, something that looks beyond just treating the phobia itself.
Yes, research has increasingly shown that having a specific phobia, especially earlier in life, is actually a surprisingly strong predictor for developing other, often more severe mental health problems later on.
Really? Like what kind of problems?
We're talking about things like generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, panic disorder, and even substance use disorders. The phobia often shows up first.
So, treating a simple phobia, like a fear of spiders or heights when someone is younger, might actually help prevent them from developing major depression or alcoholism down the road.
That's the implication, and it's a powerful one. It reframes the treatment of specific phobias. It's not just about improving quality of life for that specific fear, although that's crucial. It could be a major form of early intervention and prevention for more complex and debilitating disorders.
That really shifts the perspective. Effectively treating someone's fear of needles today isn't just about making doctor visits easier. It could potentially be a public health strategy to reduce the burden of more complex mental illness later.
Precisely. The potential downstream preventative effects of treating specific phobias early and effectively could be enormous. It makes addressing these seemingly straightforward fears even more critical.